It's 2012. Secretary of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano, has just written a memo that spells out the criteria someone needs to meet to receive deferred action under what will come to be known as DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Program. In this memo, she lays out the criteria one has to satisfy in order to be considered for deferred action. This is an exercise of her prosecutorial discretion that will allow the Department of Homeland Security to place different weights of priority on different individuals. Someone who qualifies for DACA will be subject to deferred action in the immigration context. You are an immigration attorney at an immigration firm, and you are tasked with taking this memo and turning it into an interactive Q&A. Okay, you're going to use Q&A markup, which you learned about in the last video, and your goal is to create basically this interactive interview that's going to allow someone in your firm to determine if an individual qualifies for DACA. Now, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this because it's important to get your hands dirty and understand how things work. So there's this quote from Richard Feynman that I love, which is, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." Feynman was a physicist and a teacher. And he was talking about how to really understand something, you need to know how it works. So what we're going to do in this class, in a lot of different instances, is we're going to build technology, not because we want you to be technologists, but because by building something, you'll have a better understanding of how it works. And in this first exercise, we're going to build what's called an expert system, which is going to be a way for someone who has expert knowledge to codify that knowledge, code it up, and then share it with a layperson to be able to communicate that knowledge to them. We're going to do that in the form of a Q&A interview, which is effectively an interactive flowchart. So let's get to it. Now, here's the memo. It's only 3 pages long. The relevant portion I've highlighted in red. So let's go ahead and just take a look at that and see exactly what it's saying. It's saying the following criteria should be satisfied before an individual is considered for an exercise of prosecutorial discretion pursuant to this memorandum. Came to the United States under the age of 16, has continuously resided in the United States for at least 5 years, preceding the date of this memorandum, and is present in the United States on the date of this memorandum, is currently in school, has graduated from high school, has obtained a general education development certificate, or is an honorably discharged veteran of the Coast Guard or Armed Forces of the United States, has not been convicted of a felony offense, a significant misdemeanor offense, multiple misdemeanor offenses, or otherwise pose a threat to national security or public safety, and is not above the age of 30. So we're going to stop for just a second. We're going to pause, and we want to just be very clear about what we're trying to do. We're going to make this Q&A interview. So we know from our previous video that Q&A takes basically flowcharts and turns them into interviews. So our first task is create a flowchart. And the question is, how do we do that? We have the rules that's specified in the memo, and we want to figure out what that means. Is someone eligible or not for DACA? So the first thing you know is your audience. So in this case, we said our audience were other members of our firm. So we can assume that we can use some legal terms of art, and that's not going to be something that we're going to have to explain for them. And also we're posing it such that they are determining whether or not someone else qualifies for DACA. So this is not an interview for someone who themselves is trying to determine whether or not they qualify for DACA, but a way for us to communicate our understanding of the memo to someone in our firm. So we need to ask ourselves if this is a flowchart. A flowchart is going to start off at some point, and then it's going to end up at some point. It's going to say, this is where you are. And we have to ask, well, what are those final outcomes? What are those states that we're trying to get to in the flowchart? What are the possible ways this could shake out? So the first one, obviously, is we could say they're eligible for DACA. They're eligible for this deferred action. Any guess what the other one could be? I'm just going to replicate class back and forth here by having a silent no answer on either side. Maybe I should pipe in an answer or something. Well, what's that? Oh, yes, well, another option. You're right, they could be ineligible. Okay, great. Anything else? Anything else? Well, it turns out if you actually read the memo, which is linked on the website, on the class website, you'd see that there is a situation where people can be asked to wait. Okay, so because of the dates and the ages that are involved, it might be that you need to be a little bit older. So you actually need to be over 15 in order to be considered for DACA. So you might be too young, or some other thing might not yet have happened that's going to happen, in which case we can't determine if you're eligible or ineligible. So the other option is that someone could be told to wait. So that right now makes up the universe of potential outcomes for someone who we're trying to assess whether or not DACA applies. Now we get to the part of actually making the flowchart. And the question is, well, how do we do that? Where do we start? And so what I'm going to do here is provide you with just some general sort of heuristics to use to approach how you might take some set of rules, such as the ones laid out here in this memo, and turn them into a flowchart. So the first thing we're going to do is, what questions do we need answered? All right. So let's go ahead and just go to the text. We're going to confine ourselves to this text here, when necessary, as it will be. In a couple of points, I'll draw in some places some text from other parts of the memo. But this is the majority of what we're concerned about. So what we're going to do is take these and turn them into questions. So we want to make them questions. So let's see if we can take this first line and turn it into a question. Well, let's see, came to the United States under the age of 16. Okay, well, we could just turn that into, did they enter the United States before their 16th birthday? All right, there's a question. Now, when you're making this, I sort of like to think about it like you make the question, you put it on a sticky note, and then you can put it off somewhere, and we'll come back to it, because we're going to reorder these questions and work with them in a way that makes logical sense in a moment. So now we look at this next clause here, has continuously resided in the United States for at least 5 years preceding the date of this memorandum. Okay, well, I can say, have they continuously resided in the United States since June 15th, 2007? How did I get that number? Well, I took the date of this memorandum, and it said they've resided here for at least 5 years preceding the date of this memorandum. So I went back 5 years. Okay, so I got June 15th, 2007. And it's present in the United States on the date of this memorandum. All right, so the date of this memorandum, I know that, so I can say, were they in the United States on June 15th, 2012, okay, which is the date of this memorandum. Moving on, I can say, are they currently in school? Okay, that becomes, are they currently in school? Graduated from high school or has a GED? Okay, do they have a high school diploma or GED? Or is an honorably discharged veteran of the Coast Guard or Armed Forces of the United States? Okay, are they honorably discharged veteran of the Coast Guard or Armed Forces of the United States? So some of these questions sort of write themselves. When we move on to this next bullet point, though, we see something interesting. It says has not, and then we have a set of questions. We're going to go ahead, and I'm going to suggest you set those questions in the affirmative, and we'll deal with the not here in a minute. So we'll take convicted of a felony offense or significant misdemeanor and turn that into, have they been convicted of a felony or a significant misdemeanor? That not is going to mean we're going to handle these questions differently than the other questions, but we'll get that in a minute. Right now, we're just trying to figure out what's all the information we need to know. What are the things we need to know to answer the question whether or not someone's eligible, not eligible, or has to wait. Do they have multiple misdemeanor offenses? So can they have been convicted of more than one misdemeanor? Otherwise pose a threat. So they're going to sort of go, do they pose a threat to national security or public safety? That's a bit of a more nebulous one, but that's the language of the memo. And then we have another not, we said is not above the age of 30. So we can take that and we can just say, are they below the age of 30? But we can do one better, right? The same way we did with the dates above, we actually know what it means to be below the age of 30 at the time of this, and it is in fact at the time of this memo is the interpretation that people have gone with. So what we want to know is their birthday on or after June 16th, 1981? And then actually we have to pull in a little bit of text from a part that was not in the red part of the memo that I pulled in. And it turns out there we want to know whether or not they were out of status on June 15th, 2012. And that's out of status is immigration status. And so that's something that your fellow immigration attorneys and coworkers will know. And so now we ask, what happens if we answer yes to these questions? Okay, well, we said there's that not there, which is going to act a little bit differently. So we know right away that if they answer yes to any of those things that had the not in front of them, they are not eligible, right? Because it says they cannot have had these things happen. So if they answer yes to have they been convicted of a felony or multiple misdemeanors, or they pose a national security threat, if we answer yes in response to them there, they're not going to be eligible. Okay, so we've taken it, we've turned it into questions, and now we're figuring out what happens when I answer yes to those questions. Did they enter the United States before their 16th birthday? That's not going to disqualify me. That's going to be something that I need to have be true. So I'm going to highlight that in green, just like the ones that disqualify me in red. Likewise with being a continuous resident and being in the country on June 15th. I skipped right down to, is their birthday on or after June 16th, 1981, because right now I'm highlighting in green those things that have to be true, okay, in order to be eligible. So stuff in red saying, if this is true, you are not eligible. The stuff in green has to be true to be eligible. So is their birthday on or after June 16th, 1981? And then were they out of status on June 15th, 2012, okay? And I take those, and so my green is has to be true. My red is not true. My yellow is a little bit differently. There you see they can be one or the other. So one of those things has to be true, but not all of them. Which brings us to our next question. How do we take that and map that into a set of questions that's going to get us to either eligible, ineligible, or waiting? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to group the questions, we're going to order the questions, and then we're going to connect the questions. All right, so I'm going to take a first pass here and just group them into all of our yeses to all. So we have to answer yes to all of these things. We're going to have to say yes to none and yes to at least one. Okay, so that's sort of 3 groupings of questions. And then what we want to do is we want to order our questions within these groupings. And we want to order them in level of importance. And there are different sort of ways you can approach this. And from a sort of computer science standpoint, if I was building a decision tree and I wanted to do this ordering, there are some mathematical ways you might do that roughly sort of come down to, if I have a question that's going to tell me a final outcome, just one question on its own, that question should sort of shoot up to the top. So in a sense, it's the most important questions go up to the top. So in that respect, the yes to none might really be the most important questions. But you also have to remember that you're dealing with a person. So imagine, how is this going to get used? So if this is someone else determining whether or not someone's eligible, they might be in a situation where they're talking to an individual and they're asking them these questions. You probably don't want to lead with, have you been convicted of a felony or a significant misdemeanor? That's not a good human way to open up a conversation. So there are other considerations that you want to involve. So what you want to do is you want to weight the most important questions for getting to your answer with what's going to be reasonable in getting answers out of the person you're querying. This is sort of a general principle for when you're making an interview like this. So what I did is inside of yes to all, I ordered them based upon the birthday question, because if you say that's one that's everyone's gonna really easily have at hand. You're gonna know your birthday and you don't need to ask all those other questions. If their birthday, it's the wrong birthday, they're just gonna be out. So I put that one in there. And now what we wanna do is we've grouped, we've ordered, and now what we wanna do is we wanna connect them. And so part of that also is in that ordering again. I sort of knew where I was going, so I had the yes to alls first. But I'm gonna go ahead and just start here at the top. Well, is their birthday on or after June 16th, et cetera, et cetera? Basically, if I answer yes, I'm gonna be able to get on. If I answer no to any of these though, I know immediately I'm not eligible because I have to answer yes to all of these to be eligible. So I can just go ahead and I can say, no is gonna get me directly to ineligible. If I answer yes to them, well, actually, let me jump over to the yes to no's. The same thing sort of applies there. If I answer yes to any of those, then I'm not going to be eligible. And now what I can do is I can look at the yeses, and if I get yeses, I'm going to go through. And I just go to the next question, and then I'll get myself over to the yes to no's. Likewise, if I answer no to the middle column, that's going to allow me to move on to the next question, or eventually on to the yes to at least one. So here we have, are they currently in school? If they're currently in school, do they have a high school diploma or have they been honorably discharged? I know if I say no to all of these, that's where I'm gonna wait, right? Because maybe I'm going to go back and get my GED. Maybe I'm going to join the military and then eventually become honorably discharged. Those things have not necessarily occurred yet. So even if I'm not in school, I could go back and I could get my GED. So all of these situations don't tell me definitively one way or the other whether or not I'm ineligible or eligible. So the no's just go through and go to wait. And then I can see what happens with the yeses. If I get the yeses, then I can actually just go ahead and jump over somewhere. Now, I didn't immediately jump to eligible because if you read in the rest of the memo, there is another little complicating factor, which I sort of alluded to before, which is that is the individual over 15 years of age? If they are over 15, then they're eligible based upon their answers. If they're not, then it depends on whether or not they're currently in removal proceedings, or have an order. And if they do, then they're eligible. Otherwise, they're going to wait. So basically, the rationale there is if something's about to happen, then yes, we're going to give them eligibility because we don't want them to get removed. If they otherwise would be eligible under DACA. Otherwise, we're going to say just wait and then wait till you're over 15 and come back. Now, this is a pretty straightforward set of logic. I moved through this pretty quickly. Hopefully, you've taken advantage of the fact that you're watching this on video, and if you needed to, you stopped and paused and went back and looked at things. But after we've been through all of this, we can say, oh, this is a pretty good flowchart. Now, the thing is, though, we want to make it as easy for the end user as possible. And we've already done some things to that respect. We grouped questions together so that we had the most important at the top, and we had different types of questions at different places. But, and we were really careful when we were making our questions to embed as much information in the questions as possible. So we didn't ask, were you a certain age at the time of this memo was written? We put in the actual birth date and said, were you born before or after this date? And that allowed us to make it so that the user of this didn't have to do that math, didn't have to do that extra work. So if we look really carefully at this, I want you to say, so I've built in an inefficiency here. I want you to look and see if there's anything you can spot that you could use to sort of improve this flowchart, which is to say that you could make it so that someone walking through the flowchart, at least in one instance, could get to wait or ineligible or eligible in less steps than they can right now. And what I'll do to sort of prime you for that is I'll say, think about what you know about the world. And is there information inherent in what you know about the world, which would help you actually sort of streamline this? So I'm just going to wait a second for that. And as we wait, I'll highlight something. Yeah, if you're honorably discharged from the Coast Guard or the Armed Services, do you think you're over 15? Yeah, right. I mean, it's actually illegal for you to be part of the armed forces before you're 15. So we can take some knowledge that we have from how the world works, and we can incorporate that, and we can change our flow chart now that we know immediately if you were discharged from the Coast Guard or Armed Services, well, then you're obviously over 15, and therefore you're eligible under the same set of rules we had before. It's just a little more efficient. You don't necessarily know that. You could have a very precocious child who had gotten a GED, I suppose it's possible, a Doogie Howser situation there. So you can't make that assumption about a high school diploma or a GED, but you can make that, confidently make that assumption about the armed services. So there we go. We've tightened up our flow chart, and now it's much more, well, not much more, it's a little bit more efficient. Now, here actually is a flow chart that a law firm actually did make. They actually replicated a lot of what we had. You will notice they did not, however, catch the honorable discharge situation. They still have that going yes, and then going whether or not you're 15 years or over. But otherwise, you can see a lot of that structure is the same. You can see here they had the same sort of structure of the yeses, yes, yes, yeses. They also, in this flow chart, made it nice and sort of grouped things in thematic connections as well. So you have questions about age, entry, and then criminal history, education, military experience. So that's an example of a flow chart that they made, Kragman, to determine eligibility for deferred action for childhood arrivals. As we've just seen, it's not the most efficient of flow charts, but I think this is, of all the ones that I could find that people actually produced in the moment, this is the one that, for me at least, was one of the simpler ones to get the main points across. So let's just review very quickly. How do we build a flow chart? So we have to know your audience, right? So you want to know how you're going to talk to your audience. That's going to determine what type of questions you ask, and whether or not you have to do a lot of explanation. You need to know your outcomes. That's going to determine where you're getting. And then you need to know what questions you need to ask, what things you need to know to get to those outcomes. And then you're going to group and order your questions, most important near the top. That way, if you get answers to them, they can send you to the outcomes as soon as possible. And then you want to connect the questions and outcomes based on known rules. So it's important to realize that it's known rules, not stated rules, right? So if we had just confined ourselves to the four corners of the DACA memo, we wouldn't have been able to apply the knowledge we have that there are no child soldiers in the United States. Then the next thing that you would need to do is you need to actually put this in front of someone and get user feedback. And we're going to talk a lot more in the next level about user feedback and user testing and how to make that work. But that would be the next step. And then what you would do is you would tweak things based upon that user feedback, and then you would repeat, okay, going back, getting more feedback and tweaking. So maybe that you would discover in that some of our questions weren't quite as well phrased as we thought they were. Maybe you would learn something that you hadn't known before, and you would incorporate that knowledge. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to turn this into an actual project for you guys to do. And we're going to do it all together when we are synchronously together in our class on Monday. And so here's what you need to think about as you're preparing to come in. So we're going to actually have you use Q&A markup, which you learned about in the last video. And we're going to code up that flow chart we just created together. We're going to turn it into an interactive question and answer session. We're going to turn it using Q&A markup. And here I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about the different roles that you perform while you're in the process of coding something. And so we have sort of a task and the role. And this is just to sort of help you think about what you're doing. When you're designing something, you're acting like an architect. And we've sort of done that work now. We've created our flow chart. It's sort of our logical flow. It's told us how we want to get from here to there. When you do the actual coding, you're going to figure out, okay, well, I know I want to get from here to there. How am I actually going to do that? How am I actually going to make that happen? And that's where you're actually going to put fingers to keyboard and type some stuff out and get something to happen. But once you've done that, you're going to want to test it and make sure it works. So the coding is sort of like an engineer. You're actually building something. Testing is great because then you get to be a vandal, right? Which is you try to figure out, how can I break this thing? And you want to try to throw different things at it to see whether or not you can break it. And when you find something that you can break, you try to fix it. And so that's the testing portion of things. And then when you break something or something goes wrong, you're going to debug. And debugging, you get to act like a detective. And so that's a fun, once you get into the right mindset, that can be a fun thing because you're solving a problem. You have something that isn't working and you want to make it work. And so what you want to do is you want to be very careful about how you actually go about doing your coding and your testing so that you're going to make your debugging easier. And so one of the things I'm going to suggest to you is that while you're building your flowchart, that you type a little bit of code, you test it, see how it's working, type another little bit of code, test it, see how it's working. And then at some point you might get to a place where you test it, it breaks. You then know as a detective that the thing that broke it was somewhere between the last working version you had and now. And so that's going to help you narrow in on things. If you go ahead and you write everything out first, and then you try to test it, you're not going to, and it's broken, then you're not going to know what it was that caused that break. And I want to remind you of something else. Computer programs and writing computer programs is like working for the most detail-oriented law journal editor ever, right? If you leave one period off, if you use one space instead of two at the end of that sentence, then this editor is just going to be like, I can't even read this. I can't even read this. And that's how your computer is going to respond to when looking at your code. So be very careful about what you're typing and make sure that you are typing what you intend to type, because just one character off can throw everything off. So be aware of that. That being said, here is your mission. And this does not start until we are actually in class together synchronously. So the only thing you're going to have to do is do a reading of 2 pages before we get together. Otherwise, you can rest and just think about this, and we'll hit the ground running when we meet. So you're going to read pages 1 and 2 of Debugging Strategies, which is a sheet I borrowed from a computer science professor to sort of talk about your debugging strategies. And you'll see there, this is where I borrowed the roles and the task and computer programming from. And I'll talk just a little bit about that. And what's really nice is it has some strategies for debugging. So when something goes wrong, things to think about to help you sort of be able to find those bugs, those problems, okay? And second, you're gonna turn our Docker flowchart into an interactive bot, okay? And that is your task. So I say to you, good luck.